Hey everybody, it's Mr. Barnett. Long time no see. It's been a while. Um, this is our first quarantine slideshow. So just a quick reminder for everybody, make sure you're taking notes. Just write down on a piece of paper, doesn't matter what. Largely, you want that to refer back to for when you work on your review, but it also helps you just writing that stuff down will make it you a lot more likely to remember it. So please do that. Remember, everything underlined is required. Everything else is optional. So let's just go ahead and get started. This new chapter is about agriculture. It's going to start originally about where it first came from. This is a really interesting topic. I actually read an entire book about it not too long ago, which was pretty fantastic. But I don't know if you guys would like it too much. I liked it. But first we started out with hunter-gatherers. They were the first people, these are the cavemen that you think of. They didn't farm, they just hunted and they fished, they gathered things, pretty simple stuff. Because there wasn't food readily available most of the time, they were nomadic. So they had to move around. When they used all the food in an area, they moved somewhere else where there was more food available. There's still actually people that are nomadic and are still hunter-gatherers. About 250,000 people in the world are still hunter-gatherers, mostly in Africa, but also in places like Australia, like the Aborigines, and some others as well, like in the northern tundras, like the Inuit people and stuff like that. Some of those are still hunter-gatherers. This is kind of an interesting picture for me. You see these guys, check out the shorts on that dude up there, athletic shorts. So it's not like they are completely backwater, have never had any contact with the outside world before, but that's the kind of lifestyle that works where they live still. So as humans were doing this hunting gathering thing for thousands and thousands of years, they eventually discovered that food would grow from seeds. Now, for us, it seems like duh, right? Because little kids are planting gardens all the time, right? So we should know how to do that from an early age. But it's not a natural thing to think of. That tiny little seed turning into a plant is not the first thing you would normally think of. So the guess on how this actually happened is a little bit gross. And you know how I like a gross story. So the original hunter-gatherer people who figured this out probably would travel from location to location. They would probably go seasonally, so they would live in one cave for a month or whatever, and then they'd move to another location that they knew about for a month or however long until it took them to eat all the food out of that area. But when they came back the next time they went to that area, they probably noticed that the place where they would use the bathroom started growing plants that they had gathered from miles away. So they realized that the seeds from what they had eaten were then sprouting that plant far away from where it was gathered from. So literally we learned how to farm from pooping outside of a cave, which is pretty awesome. Anyway, they started to grow these plants, and they figured it out over time. They experimented, realizing that different types of soil work better for different types of plants, how to water. They realized that manure is valuable for plants. And so we invent agriculture. We think, like I said, farming just seems like a natural thing for humanity, but it wasn't for sure. There are two types of real cultivation of plants. One's called vegetative and one's called seed. Vegetative farming is directly cloning plants. So this is when, you probably have seen the videos of this or some stuff on the internet where, like, if you cut the top off of a pineapple and put it in the ground, you'll grow another pineapple. Potatoes, especially if you saw the movie The Martian, right? He cut up all his potatoes and then planted them and grew more. That is vegetative farming. This probably started in Southeast Asia, but there are large parts of the world where it also developed on its own. West Africa and South America. South America, remember, is where Peru is where potatoes came from. So that was a big area for that as well. Then there's seed agriculture. This is planting seeds annually. This is what most of us think of as farming. Most farmers today use seed agriculture. And this probably was first practiced in Mesopotamia about 12,000 years ago. The original version of the book said it was probably India or China or something like that. But we know now from more recent research that Mesopotamia is probably the first place it happened. remember, Mesopotamia now it's basically the Iran-Iraq area. We wouldn't normally think of that as a great place to discover farming. But over time, the soil there has been depleted so much because there was so much farming happening there for so long. It used to be what we called the Fertile Crescent. And if you look at pictures now of Iran and Iraq, you would not think of it as fertile at all, but it used to be. So we're pretty sure that's where it came from, and then it diffused to other places throughout Europe and Asia. So there's really two major types beyond seed and vegetative farming. There's also subsistence and commercial. Subsistence farming, you should already know what this is. 7th grade, I taught you about this if you were at APA then. Subsistence farming is basically growing as much as your family needs to survive. It means you don't have a whole lot extra to sell. Most of the time, subsistence farmers grow just barely enough to trade for the things that they need to plant for the next year, if that makes sense. So if a piece of equipment they need is worn out or something like that, the extra that they would grow that their family doesn't consume directly would be about enough to pay for that stuff. This is really common in our less developed countries where families are owning small farms and growing things with just family members participating. And then there's commercial farming. This is what we have in the United States for the most part. This is where you grow almost all of your crops to sell. Your family or the people associated with farming that thing very rarely consume much of that. They mostly sell it all. And this is, like I said, much more common here in the United States and in other more developed countries. There's really 5 things that differentiate what subsistence versus commercial farming is. First one is purpose of farming. In less developed countries, you're mostly farming to survive. You're growing the food that you need. This can be a big problem, especially when there's droughts, because then your family could starve. Commercial farming, you're producing for selling. So you usually sell to some farmers only have one customer, right? They'll grow tons and tons and tons of corn and they'll sell it all to Malto-Meal, and Malto-Meal will turn it into cereal, right? You only have one customer potentially. So large corporations are big customers for these. Most of the time you aren't even selling to consumers directly. Percentage of farmers is very different in more developed and less developed countries. More developed countries have less than 10% of their workforce in agriculture. The United States is barely over 1% now. I think we're like 1.3, something like that. Less developed countries generally have more than 50% of their population are farmers. They're actually directly involved in agriculture. Machinery is obviously a lot more used in more developed countries as well. This means that we're able to produce a lot more food with a lot less human labor, which is why the United States can have 1-point-something% of people grow food for everyone else. We use a lot of machinery, and less developed countries have a lot less machinery to use for agriculture, which largely has to do with land size. So one of the big things that differentiates these two is that in commercial agriculture, you have huge land, plots of land that you're farming. So in the United States, the average is 418 acres, where in other places, like in China, for example, the average farm size is 2.5 acres. So they're growing on a lot less land size, which means they can't invest in machinery that could make that more efficient. It wouldn't make sense because they don't have the land area to make use of that machinery effectively. They would spend a ton of money for this machine that would only help them a little bit. But for these huge farms, they can buy a piece of machinery and it'll help them a ton. So it makes sense financially for them to buy it. One problem with farm size in the United States, even we still have some smaller farms, like our family-owned farms and things like that. And a lot of these are actually disappearing over time because they can't compete with the corporations that have huge chunks of land, because even for them, some of the machinery doesn't make sense for them to buy. If you only have 200 or 300 acres, it doesn't make sense to buy certain types of machinery, where a company that has hundreds of thousands of acres has many of those things that make them more efficient than you. And so it's sometimes putting small families out of business. They're forced to sell their land to those large corporations. So that creates some issues for them, for sure. And then I apologize. I thought I had fixed all of the slides, but I'm missing one slide. And then the last one is the relationship of farming to other industries. So kind of like what I mentioned before, farmers in more developed countries are oftentimes only selling to one customer, right? One consumer, and that would be a large corporation. You don't necessarily have to be connected with your community that much. But in a less developed country, you are selling directly to your neighbors if you're selling at all. You're trading with the guy who in your neighborhood who does the thing that you need to trade for, if that makes sense. So you have to have a good relationship with locals. In more developed countries, you need to have a good relationship with certain businesses. Transportation is a big connection that you need to have, right? So you're in a less developed country, you're more likely to connect with people. In a more developed country, you're more likely to connect with businesses. That's actually our whole slideshow for today. So nothing too crazy today. Make sure to keep on top of news articles. That's going to be also due middle of the week, Wednesday or Thursday, depending on which class period you're in. And I'm going to be assigning the country project pretty soon. So be prepared for that. All right, guys, have a great day.